So, this lecture follows on from the previous lecture in this mini-series of lectures, which was on the empires of Songhai and Mali. I'm going to talk in this lecture about the Kingdom of Kongo. The Kingdom of Kongo in West Central Africa, in the north of what is today the Republic of Angola, which in the 16th and 17th centuries was really an important country, not only in West Central Africa, but actually in the Atlantic world in general. Kongo sent ambassadors at different points in the early 17th century to the Vatican, to the Dutch Republic, to the court of the Dutch Republic in Brazil, and in the 16th century, a long-standing tradition of ambassadors held in Portugal. And often kings of Kongo would write long letters petitioning various rulers around the Western Hemisphere for various aims they were trying to secure. So Kongo was an important political unit, not only in Africa, but in the world at this period. And that's something which is surprisingly little known beyond those who are interested in the history of West Africa and in the history of Kongo. So it's a very important area to study. It's a very important region of the world to know a bit more about. The question we're going to approach in this lecture is specifically the way in which Kongo became less and less powerful in the later 17th century, and addressing the question, why did the Kongo state collapse after the Battle of Mbwila, which was in 1665? Now, to understand that, you have to know quite a lot about the 17th century prior to the Battle of Mbwila, and also the structure of Kongo itself as a kingdom. What you'd had in the 17th century was a huge expansion of the transatlantic slave trade, which was particularly prosecuted by Portuguese and Brazilian traders, and also increasingly Dutch traders, who were based largely in Luanda, which is now the capital of Angola. Luanda has a very large bay, so it was a very ideal harbour for ships in that trade. This trade had been related to increasing political instability. Different groups within Kongo and outside of the borders of Kongo, but groups who Congolese kings said they had previously, prior to the rise of Atlantic trade, controlled, fighting the Congolese for supremacy and power in the region, particularly a group known as the Imbangala, who formed a kingdom in Kasanji, near to Kongo in the 1630s. And also a very famous queen called Nzinga, who became queen of the region of Matamba, also around in the 1630s, and at various points was an ally of both the Dutch and the Portuguese at various different points. So that it was a politically very unstable time, driven by conflict, changing climate as well. This was a period when the climate was becoming more and more unstable, owing to something called the mini ice age, where temperatures became cooler and cooler in the first 40 years of the 17th century. And all of this created instability and contributed to the growth in the slave trade. In the 1640s, many of these factors came to a head. The Dutch were very keen to seize control of the Portuguese Atlantic Empire. So they invaded first some of the Portuguese holdings in Brazil and took half of the Brazilian captaincies from the Portuguese, the northern half essentially, which they controlled from the state of Pernambuco. When they took hold of Portuguese Brazil, and the sugar plantations which had grown there, they realised that it was unsustainable to maintain sugar production and the economy of those plantations without a transatlantic slave trade. And though the Dutch had never previously engaged in the transatlantic slave trade, they had traded in Africa, but previously they hadn't traded in the slave trade. They had traded for ivory, cloths, and other products which were produced by African societies at that time. However, knowing they needed to access that to maintain their colonies in Brazil, they invaded the Portuguese port at Luanda in 1641 and controlled Luanda from 1641 to 1648. The kings of Kongo, who were desperate to stop the slave trade and hadn't actually been involved in the slave trade by this point for at least 40 years, their main trade was at that time in cloths which were woven locally in Congo, allied with the Dutch, because they saw this as a way of unseating the Portuguese and their involvement in the slave trade. However, in 1648, a fleet from Brazil arrived in Angola and finally defeated the Dutch in Luanda and threw the Dutch out of Luanda, and that led to the Congolese defeat. A peace treaty was signed, but the terms were very bad for Congo, and this led to increasing problems for the Mani Congo, the king of Congo, who was Garcia II. Many of these factors contributed to deteriorating relations between the Congolese and the Portuguese, and in 1665 a Portuguese army was sent from Luanda, and at the Battle of Mbwila, both the king of Congo and, according to some sources, up to 400 members of the Congolese nobility were killed. So this was a catastrophe from which the Congolese state never really recovered. There were many different contributing factors then: the rise of political instability, the rise of global geopolitical competition, the growth of the plantation in the New World, and the emergence of a capitalist economy. And at the same time, irreconcilable differences in the Congo state itself. The emergence of a centralized state was in many ways contrary to the traditional social structures of Congolese society, which didn't allow for such a centralized state, but had a distribution of power. And when many of the nobility in the new state died at the Battle of Mbwila, this was an opportunity for the lineages who had been cut out of the previous powerful state to reassert themselves. And this was one of the causes of the civil wars which then developed in the second half of the 17th century. Those civil wars were, one way of reading that is not so much that these were civil wars, but these were actually attempts by lineages to reassert the original social structure of the Congo peoples. And in fact, one Angolan historian has described this as a response of lineages against the state. Finally, a final factor which we ought to consider in the collapse of the centralized Congo state in the second half of the 17th century is the impact of Atlantic trade on the different provinces of Congo. Congo is a kingdom with many different provinces. Its central province was the one where the capital city had been located, which was called Kongo, the city of Congo, which was quite some distance inland and near the central province of Nsundi. However, the coastal province was known as Nsoyo. Nsoyo was not an important province, particularly when the Portuguese arrived, but each of these provinces had different manis or rulers who, in a kind of federal structure, were linked into the central part of the kingdom at Kongo. Now, what happened with the rise of Atlantic trade was that the coastal province at Nsoyo became more and more important. The port at Mpinda was the place where all of the goods coming in from the Atlantic arrived, and access to that and control of it became more and more important, which allowed the Mani Nsoyo, the Duke of Nsoyo, to become more and more independent from the Mani Congo, the ruler of Congo, and at the same time meant that the ruler of Congo had less and less access to the goods that he needed in order to shore up his position. So there was also an important political contribution of the Atlantic trade in fragmenting the structure of the Congolese state. And it's interesting, finally, to reflect that this wasn't simply something which affected Congo, but was also a pattern which you can see in other parts of West Africa, for example, in Jolof, in Senegambia, where exactly the same kind of process happened between the central part of the kingdom, which was inland, and one of the coastal provinces of Kayor. So this interrelationship of globalization, the attempt of African kingdoms such as Congo and also Jolof, in fact, in the Senegambian case, to influence things in their favor, and then the way in which the rise of the plantation economy led to political fragmentation is a wide-ranging one which affected many parts of the continent.